Okay, we should be live.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Um, can you still keep the live recording while you're transferring the host perms to IO? Okay. I just got the message that folks can message IO, so we should be good to go. Thank you so much, Manny.
Of course. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. And then Coben, Dahlia, are y'all able to unmute or do you still need unmute perms? One moment.
There we go.
Okay, and then for you, Dahlia?
Okay, yeah, I'm good.
Awesome. And then Io, let me make sure you're unmuted too.
All right, can you guys hear me?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay.
No problem.
Let's get this started. Yeah, firstly, thank you all for coming here. This panel is going to be running for 1 to 1.5 hours. We have live closed captioning provided, courtesy of Nimish. Thank you so much. I'm going to start off by giving the panelists a chance to introduce themselves, and then I'll go last. And then Io, you can start us off with questions and then take some from the crowd. Let's start with Dahlia. Do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Yeah, my name is Dahlia Beckham. I use they, them, and she, her pronouns. I am a graduating senior from the Bronx High School of Science, and I've done LD for the past 4 years. I mostly engage in like critiques, more like around like anti-Blackness and queer theory, but I also dabble a bit with disability theory in like my early years. I'm also write poetry that mostly focuses on like Afrofuturism, and I'm like a huge fan of like a lot of like Afrofuturist like writers like Octavia Butler. Anyways, yeah.
All right. Do you want to go next, Coben?
Sure. I'm Coben Szymanski. I use they, them pronouns. I just graduated from St. Michael Albertville High School. I competed in public forum for 3 years, engaging in primarily stock debate, but also a little bit of performance in critical theory. And then this past year in Lincoln Douglas, I primarily engaged in performance and critical debate, mainly queer theory, but dabbling in a few other areas.
My name is Anya Tang. I use they, them pronouns. I'm in 11th grade. I'll be in 12th grade this fall at Phillips Exeter. I used to attend Penn High School, and I started with 2 years of policy debate, 2 years of public forum, and 1 year of LD. I affirmed the resolution for some time of my career. I no longer do that as much. I read anything from big stick, hard right AFs to performance AFs of every sort, particularly focusing on race and gender theory, specifically trans theory. And outside of debate, I volunteer as an educator. I organize for abolitionist and queer and trans causes. And I also do a little bit of poetry and prose. Do you want to take a sec to introduce yourself, Io?
Sure, that's fine. My name is Io Auerloven. It's my first year of debate. I did policy this year with my partner, Celia. So there's not a lot of experience under my belt, but we did go to nationals, dropped in prelims, but it's been a very enjoyable experience, and I look forward to this panel today.
Yeah, feel free to start us off.
All right, so my first question is actually open to all of you. How would you define performance debate?
I think it's like, oh yeah, Copen, sorry.
Oh, okay. I think performance debate can mean many different things to different individuals and especially to different communities. I think there are different ways that we all relate to performances based off of our lived experiences. In my experience, performance can involve different ways of affirming or negating the resolution. Sometimes it's poetry, music, or anything else from performance studies, bringing it into the debate round and building a different space than what would typically be engaged.
Yeah, I also agree. I feel like a lot of people think of like performance as being like this like sort of like one set thing where it needs to be engaging in some sort of like, I think when we think of performance we mostly think of like reading poetry or like reading like engaging in music, but I also think there are like other forms of like performances that aren't necessarily like as in your face or like as obvious. I think example that I can think of is about a couple of years ago. There, I think Mina Lee did a Asian American performance focusing on the silencing of Asian women using cards, and I think it's just like performance is one of those things where as long as you can justify it, it's as big as your brain can go.
Mm-hmm. For me, performance debate is debate. Everything in debate is a performance. Your choice to affirm the topic, to affirm the state as a heuristic, as a way in which through you act, that's a performance. That's a conscious decision that you make, and that's a decision that I think you should be held to. Similarly, my decision to not use a state as a heuristic, my decision to dance, to sing, to read poetry, to do witchcraft in round, that is a performance. And so for me, performance debate is just debate as a communicative activity. Everything I do is an act of performing, right? I can perform like a policymaker. I can perform like me, and it's become a way for me to express myself and a way for me to bring the outside, or at least my personal sphere, into the politicized sphere of debate. Because very often I don't think that I'm able to recognize within debate that the personal is political, especially when in public forum, when all the impacts that I see every single round are about recessions or the global economy crashing or about great power wars. And being able to perform in a way that is different from that is a way for me to bring the personal into the political.
Okay, that leads me to my next question. How does performance debate challenge debate's status quo?
I just echoing what Anya said earlier, I think the way we categorize performance is often used to exclude and almost securitize marginalized communities, as in reading poetry or other parts of performance in the debate round is no less of an acceptable form of debate than reading like cards or affirming or negating the resolution in whatever way you choose. Because if you look at it, like there's really no epistemological difference between poetry reading around and reading like normal literature or cards. I think sectioning it off in those different aspects is like used to like divide people. And I think that way that like viewing performance through like lyrical or narratives definitely challenges the way that people normally engage in debate in the political sphere in ways that are obviously better for specifically marginalized communities.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Coben. I think this is probably like the most, like, at least from my experience, the most obvious within LD, where I think there is a habit of like, whenever you are met with like an app that is like labeled as performance, like their most stereotypical thing to do would be to respond like, oh, with a theory shell saying you should defend the hypothetical implementation of like the topic. What I find is that a lot of times when people try to like interpret the topic in ways that aren't necessarily like engaging in like only big stick impact, but try to bring it to their personal lives, it's all that sort of like threshold for what is acceptable as like within the debate round is always pushed more and more and more. So I feel like again, it's not necessarily the fact that like they weren't able to like engage in some way. It's the fact that your performance is inherently like bringing in a mode of being that isn't necessarily seen as like worth talking about or respectable to a lot of like the way debate has structured debatability.
Yeah, I think for me, Dahlia's use of the word debatability really resonates with me, because I think one aspect of performance debate and the way I engage with it is always intended to challenge the status quo conceptions of what is debatable, or how do we teach kids, how do we teach the next year of young like freshman debaters what debatability looks like or what a good debater is. And I think of the PF videos that we show novices every year and the Nats videos that we show novices every year. I've never shown any novice that I've taught a video from the NSDA Nationals Public Forum final round, because for me, that is not the sort of education that everyone can see themselves represented in. I think our status quo conceptions of good debate is someone who we can see on Capitol Hill. And those same people on Capitol Hill are the same people legislating our bodies, politicizing our bodies, and continuing to uphold capitalist white supremacist structures of, intersected oppression that I can't engage in. In the same way that y'all might call my performance in your T framework shells playing dodgeball with hand grenades, or in the same way that y'all might argue in a truth testing framework that debate is a good space for inclusion when we read tricks because it's a place for people to escape from the personal, that teaches people in the status quo that a good debater is someone who can separate their personal life from what is political. And not all of us have that privilege, and not all of us have that capability, right? On the Medicare for All topic, I had to sit there every single round and listen to someone tell me why I can't get healthcare, or why I shouldn't get gender affirming healthcare, or why me not having the money to afford gender affirming surgery is okay because it saves 900 million people from recession, because it protects the global South using some threat constructed big stick impact that they know is easy to weigh because it's what we've been taught. And performance debate challenges the status quo for me by changing and challenging what it means to be a good debater. Because for me, being a good debater means someone who can take what you've learned in debate and give it back to your community directly. And so often what we teach kids in PF, in debate camps, in LD doesn't do that.
All right. This next question is for Coben. What is Queer Nation, and was there anything in particular that made you choose to talk about that topic?
Yeah, I think a lot of the performance and literature that I engaged in my time in LD was focused on like organizing tactics within the debate space in historical LGBTQ plus activism struggles, whether that was ACT UP, Queer Nation, Bash Back, or other struggles, or I guess anarchist collectives that queer people engaged in to fight against structures such as like capitalism, white supremacy. And I think the way that I formulated that argument was reconceptualizing the United States as a form of political protest of the queer body, and then reimagining the resolution as a space to discuss, I think it was like what voting would look like within a structure that isn't necessarily capitalistic, which is where like futurism comes into it, because debate is inherently a futurist project, as in we are imagining a different future when we affirm or negate the resolution. It just becomes a question of what future do we imagine. And I think that was a way for me to engage in a performance. I think I played music, and like there was like lyrics and narratives, reimagining the future that we're affirming or negating through a different performance.
All right, this next question is for Dahlia. This is regarding the state study bop AC. I read that earlier, and I noted the use of language appeared to be more than just something to affirm universal child health care to be guaranteed. What I read was something that raised more emotion, more feeling. Could you tell me more about that? What the work that went into that?
Wait, I didn't hear this first part. Which one?
The state's Diddy Bop AC.
Oh yeah. I think at the time I was like pretty much like, I think at that time I was sort of like in a point in my life where like anyone who's sort of like been keeping up with me knows that I'm just sort of like not in a place where I guess my sort of like position, like my positionality as like being a queer person in an African family sort of like makes it feel like there was no structure that I could have relied on to gain any sort of like substantial respect of my like gender identity or like my wishes to like either socially or medically transition. And I wasn't necessarily sure what sort of like way I could like incorporate the Diddy Bob AC into like the state's topic. And so like reimagining like universal child care as like what the Diddy Bob AC was focusing on, which was making debate or like making the debate space a place where I can continue to perform the AV, was sort of like in a way saying, even if like the act doesn't like really happen, or even if like we can't like ensure any sort of like physical change for like the places that we live in through reading the AF, that at least the debate community provides like a safe haven away from my family, which would allow me to continue like to affirm myself, which is something that I found like super useful throughout this year, especially due to the fact that we couldn't travel.
Right. This next question is for Anya. Why did you and your partner choose the song Take Me to Church for the Georgetown Sidewell W2 AFNAG used in PF?
Yeah, so we picked Take Me to Church, I remember, because of the specific lyrics about being sick and needing healing, and the song's focus on religion as a site where you can be healed, but as a redefinition of what religion can be. Because for me and for many other queer and trans folk, religion is a source of so much racial trauma, familial trauma, even like intergenerational trauma. And so much of that is tied with our identities and our bodies as queer and trans folks. And so Sean and I, we picked Take Me to Church because, you know, for an AF where we perform a trans future, where we can have a world where everyone gets the queer and trans healthcare that they need without any question of, you know, of what religion might act as like a barrier or as a source of trauma for that. That was a way for us to use that Hosier song to both queer religion as a site for imagination, and also to queer healthcare. You know, like queerness is viewed as something that is oftentimes sick or something that's needing to be cured. That's a lot of the times like a politicized narrative of what it is. And so to redefine that was a way for us to really use the theme of futurity in our performance, because, you know, let's imagine a queer and trans future where queer and trans healthcare, you know, isn't about turning queer and trans people into something cishet. It's about letting us celebrate ourselves, and, you know, queering and you know, transifying religion is what this AF is about. It's about imagining a future where these sources of trauma, these sources of barriers are now the same things that help us grow and cultivate ourselves and care for each other.
So then follow-up question to that, do you believe that if you had, like, let's say you didn't play music at all during your after next speech, do you think that would have substantially taken away from what you were saying?
I think so, yeah, because then in that performance, the only thing we'd have was like a couple of narratives, a lot of Magnot's cards. And for me, music was a way to communicate with people who had never seen performance debate before, because everyone listens to music, and music is such a common form of performance in all of our cultures, right? Like we listen to the music and we say, you know, this is a message that I understand. And so it acts as a gateway into the narratives that we're giving and the literature that we're producing as well. Like, you know, this is part of the music, this is part of the song, this is all part of the performance.
Were there any other songs that were in contest with Take Me to Church, or was that the only one because it just said something different than the other ones?
Yeah, there were a lot. We looked at Frank Ocean 1ACs, we looked at a lot of other performance apps in the past that played music. We ultimately decided we didn't want to play music from a Black or brown artist, because neither of us are Black or brown, and we don't want to commodify that music and commodify that unique narrative and position of being a Black or brown queer and trans person, because that's what those narratives are about, that form of music. And so we picked a straight man's music, which is strange, but, you know, in doing so, listening to his music and the role that it has in, you know, the queer and trans community, we understand that there's a collective memory and a collective meaning of what Take Me to Church means that is shared by everyone, that is not necessarily the narrative of a BIPOC queer and trans person that we would be extracting from. So it was a matter of respect and not extracting from other folks' narratives, but also a matter of understanding, finding a song that really, I guess, resonated with our collective memory.
All right, this question comes from the audience. How do you handle debating both sides of the topic where one side is fundamentally goes against your personal moral framework or ideals?
Yeah, I think I think this question is with the assumption that the way debating the topic like normatively. So for example, the NSDA has given debaters lots of topics which would either made them unsafe or securitized by the state with the research they would have to engage in. So I think that's under the assumption that you either affirm or negate the resolution in the way that other debaters would. So I think in that situation, you probably, if you're comfortable with it, you don't have to debate in the way that other debaters are debating, because everyone comes to this space for different reasons. So that could look like engaging in performance debate or a protest or issuing your narratives, or any other form of debate that you want. And it doesn't necessarily have to affirm or negate the resolution as you had thought previously, or even at all, because that's not why some people come to this space. And I think it's important to recognize that.
Yeah, I think this issue hasn't like really like at least come up for me within my senior year, because whenever I sort of like thought that I would have to like compromise my ideals and like before like I guess like debating aside the resolution, I'd just be like, I'm not gonna do that. Like I just don't feel like, I mean, like if I'm not like I guess it's like there, so a lot of people usually say like the benefit of that is to like have some sort of like I guess like general like or like overall more knowledge of the topic overall. But I guess like there are other people, they like, as we can see, there are clearly other people who do not like really care about like sacrificing their like positionality to be able to like learn about those sort of things. So like, why am I someone who is like could be directly impacted by those things, willing to sacrifice my mental health to that sort of work?
Mm-hmm. Similar to Dahlia, my thoughts / advice are just don't do it. Do whatever you want. Debate is a place where you can do whatever you want. The NSDA does not control what you get to read or what you don't get to read. I mean, technically there are no counterplans in PF, but like, again, the NSDA at the end of the day doesn't expressly limit what you get to or don't get to read. More directly answering this question though, I think this is a valid like point of concern, especially for folks who aren't as well acquainted with different styles of debate, or they grew up not learning different styles of debate. Like for me, doing policy my first few years, I had to sit there and think during the 2018 to 2019 season, what are some reasons why I might not want the US to reduce immigration restrictions? And that was really hard for me. And it happened again my first year debating PF on the February topic. I had to sit down and think, what are some reasons why I think I should get rid of welfare, the welfare that I'm on, so that I can, maybe get $1,000 check in the mail each month. And so when I come into each topic with these predisposed conceptions, I think to myself, not what is the most, disagreeable take that I can come up with that I'm going to try and learn about to defend, because I am not going to read I'm not going to read the white supremacist literature so that I can try and defend something proximate to that. That's not how I understand or try to, better gauge what white supremacy looks like so I can fight against it. I'm going to learn about white supremacy from my other BIPOC organizers, right? And so that means for me, when I have a position where I don't want to defend that position conventionally, I just try to reimagine what that position can look like, right? Maybe I don't think the US should substantially reduce immigration restrictions because I don't think the US federal government should be the one doing it. I think that, I think the people should get rid of borders. I think the people should graffiti the border wall. Or for UBI, I can defend that I don't think welfare is good, because I don't think that the state should be using a program that, they get to individually determine who's eligible for welfare or not. I think that we should have a community where we can all just give each other communal care from ourselves, by ourselves, for each other. And so it comes down to, when I have to defend a resolution I don't want to defend, I don't do that by defending a morally reprehensible position or learning about a morally reprehensible position, because I don't think that's good education. I think critically, what's a way that I can critically approach this position And in doing so, I find a way to criticize other methods of resistance and other methods of liberation. And then we can have a more constructive discussion about what is the best method of liberation for oppressed folks, or the best method of dismantling these structures of oppression.
Right. Our next question also comes from the audience. As a beginning debater, how would you suggest one begin to incorporate performance into our debates, especially LD?
Let me unmute Dahlia, one moment. Okay.
Sorry, sort of like impulse unmuted. I think it was like definitely like a problem I had, because the way that I sort of like got into performance is that like I did like I guess sort of like traditional debate for a year, and I just like jumped like straight to like the deep end. Honestly, I can't really like I can't understate like the benefits of just like reading your literature if you're going to like read like K's, which I think like seeing like a lot of like their like LD like circuit now, it sort of like feels like obvious that like a lot of people don't really like sort of like, number one, know like really well what their literature is saying, which can't be helped because like we're high schoolers, which is like understandable. But also number two, to understand sort of like the implications of any sort of action that you do within this round, which I think what like goes back to what Anya was saying about how like debate, like anything that you do in debate, is performance. And so when you approach debate like from that angle, it's sort of like, okay, in this ideal model of what debate should look like, or what this ideal world of what debate should look like, what sort of things are like fundamental to debate, and what sort of things can we like, I guess, push away? For example, like debate will always have a ballot, right? Debate will always have a judge, but that doesn't mean that we have to like use a topic as a starting point to debate, like to like determine who uses the ballot, who gets the ballot. Or for even then, you don't need to like focus on like, I guess, like cards as either way. You can be like, oh, we can just like show like what sort of poetry is like a better way for us to like, I guess, engage in some sort of like community building. And so when you sort of like understand that debate is sort of, you can sort of like take and like bring things into debate as you want, that like sort of like the way that like a lot of like theory debates say like, yeah, your sort of like model is self-serving, arbitrary. Like, yeah, all of our models are self-serving and arbitrary. It's just like, it's a matter of what we need for the models that we want to take care of us, and what sort of like implications that has for like how other debaters interact with that model.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, for sure. And I think it's with the recognition going into the debate space, whether that's PFLD or policy, that everything you say and everything you do in debate is a performance. It's just a question of what type of performance do you want to read, or what type of narratives and experiences and arguments do you want to bring into the space. If by performance you mean like music or lyrics or critical theory within LD, I think in a practical sense, you can watch videos of old rounds where people are reading performances, because I honestly think that's the best way to learn. Or when you are debating on the circuit, engaging with whatever marginalized community you may belong to, if you're reading that literature or not. Because I think that part of community building within the debate space that can be very violent is very helpful, because not only can you all support each other, forming like a community of care within debate, which I think happens quite a lot for good reason. But also there's like prep sharing and research, and you can have your questions asked, because I think like that form of organic intellectualism where you're all as a community forming your arguments is really important and helpful, and something that I found to be okay.
Yeah, big agree with Coben on the whole communities of care. Like, this shit is exhausting. Like, imagine you go to a debate tournament every week, and every week someone tells you the same exact thing, that the TVA, the topical version of the AF, is that, you know, you can go tell the US federal government to do something to help the queers, right? And it's like, it's exhausting. We get tired of hearing that. We get tired of y'all running the same exact T framework shell every single round. And so finding people that, you know, you can continue to do work with, research with, bounce ideas off of, like, hey, maybe how do I prep out this shell? How do I understand this literature? What is this telling me? Can I read this literature? Like, am I in the correct like social location? These are all helpful things because the community is what creates shared structures of accountability to hold people accountable, but to also care from them. So we're able to learn from our mistakes and move towards being better debaters. A community is a form of education, and I think it's the best form of education that performance debaters, especially those just starting out, can really get into. So I would say find the people that you look up to in the space. Find the people that look like you in this space who read arguments like you or read arguments that you want to read, and just reach out to them, get to know them. That's how I met Coben and Dahlia, honestly, yeah. And I would not be debating like this without them and without their support. Additionally, I would say, like, for me, because I started performance in policy still when I was in like an under-resourced program with like no performance coach. Even now, I go to a much more privileged school. I have a lot more educational privilege, but I still don't have those resources that, like, you know, people who do LARP debate might. Like, I don't do debate drills. I don't do Potomac debate. The way that I got into this whole world of performance debate was just through watching videos. Like, the first performance video I watched was the NDT, the National Debate Tournament 2013 finals from Emporia University, Ryan Walsh and Elijah Smith, versus Northwestern. And I think that video is something that everyone should watch, even if you've never done debate, even if you don't do debate, don't plan on doing it. It's something that I recommend to everyone, to watch that video and to watch the 2AR, the last speech that Ryan gives in the round, which, you know, is what pulls through that 3-2 ballot for Emporia, because that firstly gives me so much of the motivation and energy I need to continue doing performance debate. And it also introduces to me what performance debate is. And, you know, it gives me a gateway into learning more about literature, right? Like, I learn about narrative and storytelling, and I learn about a critical interpretation of the resolution. And it teaches me, you know, I need to do more than just read this literature and read this theory. I need to go out in my community and see how these policies that we're talking about, how they directly affect people. And I need to see how these structures directly affect people and understand how these structures directly affect me. That's the radicalization process, right? Like, not just sitting in our armchair and reading theory, but also going out into the streets, learning about what performance looks like and what that effect can have on your community, and then bringing that back to debate to say, we can make a coalition here and we can teach others to do the same for their communities. So let's do it.
All right. Give me a second. All right, this is a question from the audience for the entire panel. This person said, I struggle to read performance apps a lot because typing myself and my body as a trans girl to the ballot in competition, opening myself up in that way to the community is really emotionally difficult for me. Do any of y'all have advice for trans or minority debaters who have that same struggle with performance?
I think this is something I especially like dealt with this year, as like someone who pretty much like through debate tournaments just like stayed in my room all day, like just looking at like the computer screen. I think it's like one of those things where you sort of just like make sure, like, if you're honest, like there are like times where like if I honestly did not feel up to it, then I really like thought that like I should have just like maybe like dropped around sometimes if that's like feeling overwhelming. Like if you are feeling extremely overwhelmed at the thought of like, or like if you're feeling extremely overwhelmed while you're like about to have a round, then sometimes it's okay to just like take a break from like the tournament for a little bit. But I also feel like having like sort of like going back to like the communities of care, having people that you can talk to about these things, having people who can support you even when you're like really at the lowest of your lows, honestly goes like a long way to like making yourself keep going even when it feels like the entire rest of like the world is against you. I think additionally just like knowing that there are people who like will like sort of like will sort of like inevitably like look at your like sort of like rounds and things that you read and see that there is like the possibility of like liberation that can like be like sort of like imagined through debate sort of like makes me think that, oh, even if like right now I'm not feeling like super up to the task, that later I will look back on this, and later there are other people who will look back on this that will like allow me to sort of like, I'm not sure how to describe it, but like sort of like it's a sort of drive that there is like something to look forward to through all the work that you've done at the end.
I think I definitely agree with everything Dahlia said. I think it's always remembering why you're engaging in the liberation struggle inside of the debate space, so that you don't become alienated from whatever labor that you're producing or whatever performance that you are reading inside of the space. Because there will be microaggressions and macroaggressions in all forms of violence in this space because of the way that white supremacy, capitalism, and other oppressive structures interact with the type of arguments we read and the knowledge that most people have and preconceptions they have coming into the space. So that will happen. And you have to be prepared for that and recognize that if you aren't ready to do that on your own or individually right now, maybe create a community of care, maybe keep reading the literature, maybe find other ways to perform that aren't the debate space, that aren't uniquely violent. Because I think debate is unique in that it forces your performance into a obviously mainly white space, mainly cis space, where if you felt more comfortable maybe creating performance or liberation struggle in just your own community, I think finding a place to do that can also be really important because while yes, I do believe in the benefits of debate as the space for performance, it's not the only space by any means. So I think remembering that also is important.
Yeah, building off of what Coben said, and I'm going to preface everything I say by saying I don't speak from the perspective of a trans woman, and I understand the person asking this is a trans woman, so please take everything I say with a grain of salt. I think that one thing that is really hard for a lot of performance debaters when they first start out that I've seen and heard repeatedly is they feel like they are alone in their performance, because when you enter that round, it's just you, or in some cases it's you and your partner, but it's just you and the judge and your opponents, and it's very easy to feel isolated, and it's hard to access that community, that communal sense when you are in the debate space and when you have that ballot tied to what is functionally, your performance or your identity. And so one of the best things to remember is that you are never alone in what you do. That as soon as that debate round ends, there are people who are going to be cheering for you, who are going to be checking in on you, asking if you made sure to drink water during the round, telling you to take a break, step away from the screen. You are never alone in the performance that you engage in. You are never alone in the work that you engage in. This work is part of a greater collective struggle, emphasis on the word collective. And that is what really, helps you get, or at least helps me get through rounds. And then also what Dahlia said, if you need to concede a round, do it. I conceded my bid round at my first LD tournament ever. I conceded quarters at Cyprus because I just could not do it. Earlier in that tournament, someone had misgendered me and then accused me of lying about my gender for a ballot. And so I just couldn't do it. I just conceded my bid round. I went to bed, took a nice nap, and then I cared for myself, because chances are somebody impact turning sexism in the debate space drank their water and had their 3 meals today. Did you? Or conversely, somebody in the debate space who read a performance, who sang in the round, who advocated for struggle as well, they drank their water and they had their 3 meals today. Did you? Right? Like, that's part of being part of a community, is caring for yourself is part of caring for others. And sometimes you need to be the person who drinks that water and has those 3 meals so that someone else can think to themselves, someone in my community cared for themselves today. Did I? And that's part of what keeps us going, especially in regards to the emotional labor performance for trans folks.
Just really quickly, I think debate puts so much emphasis on the production of labor or value within the space, and disvalues oftentimes performances for that reason and views them as not valuable because they're not the normal conception of what debate should look like. And I think the same thing goes for participating in tournaments. You should not be participating because you want the wins and losses, but rather the struggle, the knowledge that you gain from this space and the experiences and community struggle that you can engage in. And you can't do that when you're not feeling well or you can't work safely in whatever space you're working within. So I think remembering not to detach yourself from the labor and struggle you're engaging within, and always remembering to take care of yourself. Like I'm sure, like I also like conceded around, dropped out of like Princeton. Like people do it, and there's a reason why. It's not like shameful, not deciding like not to debate. It's taking care of yourself, and really, really important.
All right, the next question. What is the best method of persuading the judge to be sympathetic to your futurism or theory over policy?
I think like at least I think the best way to sort of like articulate this is to sort of just like I think okay, so when you get into like a debate round, right, and you're like, it's me, I sort of like hype myself up. I go to my like computer screen, I'm just like, damn, I'm here. And I think a lot of people when we sort of like are in the round or like within like the debate space, whether it's like physically in a tournament or now like digitally, we sort of like sometimes lose the idea that like debate is like this like isolated space. Like for example, like I think like this also like comes up a lot of casual conversation. Like when I'm talking with debate friends, I'll be like talking like debate lingo, and then like a lot of people will be like, "What does that mean?" But I feel like you sort of like need to like talk to you need to like sort of like ask the judge, why are we here? And I think like a lot of like people like a lot of people sort of like take that question for granted. Like we're like here to debate like the resolution or like here to engage in this form of like policy making, but you sort of like need to focus on like number one, whether anything that happens within the debate space according to their form of like what we should be debating, whether like the resolution or policy making will be spilling out or will take outside to the real world, especially when the majority of us aren't going to be in positions of power that will allow us to be able to like have a direct or like I guess like a top down impact on how like the government works. But also number two, that if we aren't going to be able to I guess engage, be within like structures or like positions of power, like that are like inherently hierarchical, that what sort of things do we take out of the debate at that point? And whether, and if, I guess like when we take those things out of the debate, how are we able to sort of like share that with those like outside of or like who are also marginalized within debate? And so by that, I sort of like mean like, it's like sort of like performance as like a way of establishing like communities of care. That's a thing that doesn't necessarily need of us to like focus on the resolution or policy making, but it is an appeal to the judge to recognize that like there is a way for us to engage in the space or isn't necessarily just like, oh, we just need to like hyperfixate on these rigid like rules of what debate should be. And so it's always just like questioning what sort of things like what policymaking actually does for us, like if we aren't going to be in those positions, or what sort of like the resolution has to us like personally. At least that's the way I sort of like think about it.
I definitely agree with all of that. And I think it's important to recognize the judge as a member of the community as well, whether that's specifically in the context of public forum, obviously has a knowledge base and lived experience that's most likely going to be different than yours, and whatever experience or community relation that they have, that those biases will always be in the round. But then it's just a question of how you're going to approach that discussion. Like Dahlia said, reminding the judge of like why we're in this space in the first place. Even if you need to change the radical nature of your performance based off of the judge, which sometimes is necessary in like coalition building. Just recognizing it from that perspective, and how you want to go about convincing the judge of like how your performance relates to the resolution or the topic that you want to be discussing, or anything else for that matter.
Yeah, echoing what Coben's saying, the judge is a member of the community. Like, someone who took their time out this weekend to listen to like high school debaters talk about a given resolution likely has the same kind of care and energy that they have for other aspects of life that mimic debate, right? Because debate is a microcosm of broader life. So this person probably goes to their town council meetings. They probably vote. They probably are an educator or a parent or someone that cares for others and is cared by others. And the way that we introduce these radically different topics to them is, at least for me, through relationality, right? Like, what is this judge seen that I know I've also seen? Because I recognize that, everyone in the room, including the judge at the back of the room, has been impacted by the structures that impact me in some way, whether, they are proponents of it, whether they are unknowingly complicit in it, whether they are actively themselves working against it in their own ways. Finding some way to relate to that judge is the first step in articulating the different nature of your performance. And sometimes, if I see that on the panel there's someone I absolutely, cannot debate in front of for whatever reason, like I will have judges struck because of past interactions with them or past harm that they've done to me or my community, that I know that, I'm not in a position right now where I can have you in the back of the room judging me. I will not debate for the judge, right? Like, a ballot is a ballot. There is another high schooler in the room with me, and if at least one person in the room can walk out having learned something, having changed something, and if that one person is a high schooler, that's fine with me. I don't always have to debate with the judge, right? Like, next season, I don't expect to pick up a single ballot in public forum, and that's fine by me, because I don't always debate for the judge.
All right, next question. How should debaters interact with performances in round?
I think the first thing to recognize is your positionality when you're debating or engaging in a discussion of a different liberation struggle, in any like biases that you might have, or complicitly engaging in any oppressive structure that through the narrative or performance of whatever debater you're engaging with, they're trying to fight against. I think recognizing that when you go into the round is really important. Not because it's going to be a fix-all for whatever discussion you might engage in. I think it's just an assumption and recognition that everyone needs to recognize before you start debating. And then I think also the next thing to do would be to engage in the discussion and performance in good faith, and follow the lead of whatever someone else is doing, or whoever debating, whoever is engaging in the performance is doing, and not dismissing the labor and work and collectivity and community that they've engaged in order to bring that performance onto the debate space is really, really important.
All right, I've gotten several questions about the video Anya referenced earlier. It's titled The NDT 2013 Files with Emporia SW. I highly recommend that you all go watch that. Moving on to the next question, someone asked, as a non-binary POC debater, I really want to get into writing Ks, and I'm curious as to what rebuttals y'all have encountered that aren't offensive or tiring, like Anya mentioned earlier.
I guess I can start with this. My favorite rounds are always KVK, performance versus performance, anything like that, right? Like, my goal when I read a performance is not to throw you off guard, is not to destroy the debate space, although it definitely can be. It's my broadest goal is always to move towards a best method of collective struggle and collective liberation for me and my community, to care for me and my community, and to educate all the people in the room. Whether that means I'm yelling at you for reading or saying something problematic, or whether I'm literally just reading poetry in round. It's always been something constructive. And the best rebuttals that I faced are the ones that accept that this is something constructive and try to engage with it in that constructive way. They say, I recognize what you're doing. I think that what you're doing has a flaw here, here, and here. And here's why I think it's hurtful to, these broader structures, this community. Here's what I think we should be doing instead, or here's how we can combine and modify this, this performance or this method. here's a different approach, here's a different framework we can take. Anything that recognizes the constructive nature of performance is, something that I'm always happy to engage with. But if y'all pull out the same exact T framework, cap 2 off, then the same exact 5 different presumption warrants, then I know you didn't take that time to think about what this performance means to me and to my community, right? That is disingenuous to me. And sometimes if that's all you got the energy for, I recognize that, but at that point, that is something that hurts both me and everyone else is in the room's educational capability to learn from that round. So the best rebuttals are the ones that genuinely engage with the AF instead of bringing out their predetermined assumptions about what performance debate is or about what I'm doing in the space.
Yeah, I definitely agree with a lot about Andrea said, but something I want to focus on is sort of the fact that you need to recognize if you're going to engage in the AF, that you need to provide some sort of alternative model or action that we can do besides the AF. I think just sort of a lot of the reasons why the typical T the sort of TKO offense falls apart is because none of it is really constructive. For example, a lot of the sort of alternative, not of the way that K the cap K is structured in response to performance apps is that it's the same generic, oh, your focus on identity is bad and we should just all join the party, when very often a lot of these performance apps will be very anti-capitalist in nature. It's just that you don't want to look at the specifics of what the app is saying. Again, that's sort of being disingenuous about not wanting to actually build something. And I feel there is sort of a lot to, I feel there is a lot of potential, I guess, especially in when you don't really know and a lot about the app and you want to go for something creative, that you can make theory shows that aren't just the same you need to defend the resolution. There are other ways that you can engage in some sort of I guess I guess I was trying to say is there are other ways that you can engage in criticizing the structure of the AV as opposed to just approaching it from oh, it was unfair for you to not debate the resolution.
Mm-hmm. And just to quickly add on to that, I think I was going to mention this earlier. I think viewing debate as a lens of fairness is incorrect in many ways, because there are different types of fairness. There's structural fairness, and then there is what people call procedural fairness. So, and if this is also another mention, if you haven't read about or the literature or the community engagement that was created during the Louisville Project or Dr. Reed Brinkley's work, you should definitely do that too. But what I was going to say is that people come to this space for different reasons and for different things. And there are structural barriers to people entering the space and engaging in it before the round even starts, which is why approaching it from a blank slate, how do competitive equity work within this round perspective is probably incorrect. And then also to add on, yeah, class reductionism is unequivocally bad. Don't do it. We need to be building our community struggles through different identities with the acknowledgement that we should be fighting against capitalism too, broader structures.
Yeah, just to add on to a little bit about what Coben said about the difference between structural procedural fairness, I think again a lot of people who do use sort of that, even when they do make that differentiation, they tend to prioritize procedural fairness when according to what Coben just said, it's very obvious that if anything, structural fairness comes first, because it's sort of what controls how people are able to enter the space in the first place. So yeah.
All right, moving on to the next question. How can non-LGBTQ and non-BIPOC debaters appropriately engage with the methodology proposed by an identity-based argument?
This sounds a little bit similar to what the non-binary debater had asked earlier about what's the most effective rebuttal. So for all my white cis het men out there, and women, my bad. But yeah, for all my white people out there, just be constructive. read a K, read a performance, listen to what I'm saying. If I'm asking you to concede the round, concede the round. Like at the end of the day, the ballot is going to matter less to you and to the things that you're reading than to arguably what I'm reading, right? Like a ballot is a piece of paper for you, but for me in this round where I read my performance, I'm articulating to you that it matters a lot more. That is a way for me to educate and change debate as it is, to reimagine a debate space where I don't have to hit the same T framework shell every single round telling me that the state heuristic is the best and only way in which I should be engaging with this space. So if you are white and you are cis het, the best thing you can do is listen to the other debater. You can understand your own social location and what you're allowed to read and what you really shouldn't be reading. Like, I don't want to see anyone, white or not, making an ontological stance on a identity group that they do not belong to, ever. And additionally, like, you can do the same thing that I've told other people to do in my last response, right? Like, go out in your community, think about how these issues affect you, because capitalism definitely does affect you. White supremacy affects white people. Cis heteronormativity affects cis het people. And these structures intersect along with like colonialism and imperialism to affect people who are very much privileged or complicit in these systems. You need to recognize how these systems affect you, how they affect your community, and then come back into the space and come back into those rounds with that knowledge of what you think you should do to change your community and how that might make another person's performance, you know, flawed or incomplete, or you might suggest another perspective to look forward to, because, you know, your perspectives are just as valuable as mine. Even if you're speaking from a different social location, it's just important for you to recognize what those perspectives are and how you can articulate them without speaking over my voice.
I think there's also something to say about like how a lot of people, when I think of like when I think of like the idea of like engaging in the method you have, a lot of like people who are debating or like debating on the net would be like, how can I like, I guess like engage in like methods like Afrofuturism if they're like a non-black person. Like I think a lot of like people assume that any sort of methodology needs to have like equal access to those that is not like meant to serve, and it's not meant to say like, oh, like no methodology should be like be able to like I guess like be applied by people who are on like I guess highlighted in those groups. Like for example, like a methodology that might be available to like a black cis person might not be available to like a black like non-cis person. But like when it's sort of like an idea of like the oppressor versus the oppressed, and you ask us to make our sort of like ideas more palatable to you, instead of like just take the L. Like honestly, just take the L at certain times. Like especially when like I guess like especially when a lot of those times the question is never like, how am I able to engage in your app in like a constructive manner? Is always like 9 times out of 10 presented as like your app being presented, or like your methodology being like presented as like not being to like engage in it, is like inherently violent to the other person, which is like weird, because I think like Arnie is very like right, like at the end of this day, it's like days like it's just like like if, especially when you haven't explicitly talked about why your sort of like well-being is staked on the ballot, then why do you care about the ballot other than just like getting some sort of sense of self-gratification?
Coben, do you have anything to say? Because if not, I was going to add on something.
No, you can go ahead.
Okay, awesome. There's a quote from Latinx poet Jose Olivares from Citizen Illegal that goes, "There are white people in heaven too. They build condos across the street and ask the Mexicans to speak English. I'm just kidding. There are no white people in heaven." And the last sentence, "There are no white people in heaven," is something that I really think white debaters should take away from this, right? Like, it's okay if there are no white people in heaven in your performance, right? Like, it's an interpretation of what the future looks like. And that is a structural resistance and a structural response to what systems of oppression look like for me and you, and how they affect me and you, and how they shape our ability to construct different imaginations of what these structures can be. And so if something, if something is affecting you as a person in a place of privilege, then, you should be thinking, what is the best thing that I can do, not as an ally, because, the question isn't what's the most respectable way or the least offensive way in which I can beat your ass. It's a question of what can I do to better aid this collective struggle? And if that way is to concede the round, then that's perfectly fine. In the word of Dahlia, if you need to take the L, by all means, get comfortable with taking the L. And if you don't think that's the right thing to do, if you don't think that's a constructive thing to do, that's a completely valid perspective, right? If you think that there should be white people in heaven for whatever reason, or you think that, a different perspective, a different understanding, a different reading of our literature is necessary, you can present that and you can argue your case, right? That's what debate is. It's a discussion space for different methods of collective struggle. But at the end of the day, that should be your goal, not the ballot, but your goal should be collective struggle.
All right. Next question. What is your ideal structure of debate, if not centered around current events and politics?
I don't necessarily think that most debaters take issue with argumentation and engagement surrounding issues that are called like current events or politics, but rather performance debaters or debaters that are pushing what normative conceptions of engagement should look like take issue with how we construct how debaters should be engaging in current events and politics. So that discussion is fine. It's just a question of how that discussion happens. And if that discussion doesn't include people from marginalized identities being able to bring their narratives, poetry, lyrics, music, dance into the round, then that's not a type of current events or politics or political struggle that we should be engaging in. And I think debate is an excellent space as it is currently structured to engage in a struggle for liberation in coalition building. But it's just a question of the powers that are in debate excluding those marginalized voices and narratives and engagement in favor of what we view as politics in current events, which typically in power making doesn't include people from different backgrounds.
I think for me, yeah, like I still want to talk about current events and politics, right? Like I'll still talk about NATO. I'll still talk about, water resources. I'll talk about criminal justice reform. Those are current events in politics. I'm just not going to talk about them from the perspective of, reading, thinking that these impacts are going to lead to a great power war, that they're going to lead to a global economic collapse. And that's the most important thing that I should be learning about or taking away from the round. Like, I think that discussions of US drug policy are important, and I think that all our literature, I think that, literature about race, about gender, disability, those are all about current events and politics always, because the personal is always the political. You cannot separate those two. I just want to look at current events and politics from a different way than, some people do. But yeah, my ideal structure debate would be, honestly, it probably would be that like debate gets a lot more decentralized. People start going outside. People start engaging more in the communities and structures and learning from people who engage in those collective struggles of liberation. But I think that if debate had to exist in this ideal reconception for me, everyone would do whatever they want. Everyone would read a performance probably. Maybe everyone would read some poetry, talk about a narrative, or they would, they would engage with the debate that doesn't involve us pretending that things like capitalism, white supremacy are good enough structures that we can engage in, and that, in the hopes that maybe if we engage with them strongly enough in the right way, that they're one day gonna somehow be a little bit better for us individually, because that's not the kind of struggle that I want to participate in. That's not collective.
I've sort of been like, well, I definitely do agree with like Hope and Anya about like the utility of like debate as like not only like a way to like learn about like current events, but also engage in them in sort of like a personal, like in a personal way, a way that actually like affects us. But I also think like I personally, since I engage in debate as like sort of like a side of relief, or like a side of like, I guess, like venting in a way, it's sort of like a lot of those times, like, yes, we can talk about like current events and like politics, but also I just sometimes just want a place where I can exist. And I think like sort of like, I think debaters think those two things are mutually exclusive, when like the current state of debate shows that it's very much not. Like performance, like, yeah, debaters exist. Like a lot of performance debaters, like right now, like in SASCO. And as you can see, the debate space has not like imploded on itself. So like, I guess like what I'm trying to say is that like, we can have those discussions, but when someone is like steps into the round and says like, I'm not doing that, I want to talk about something that will like almost immediately affect me more, you just sort of like sit down and be like, all right, I guess it's like sort of round that we're having today, and just like take it. You'll have another like LARP round like within this tournament. You're gonna be fine.
All right, next question. How can abolitionist arguments combat reformist arguments?
I hate to bring the word dialectic into this conversation. I'm really sorry I had to be the one to do it. I'm really sorry, but this makes me think of, just like reformism versus like revolution, right? And I also hate to bring a white leftist into this conversation as well. So that's a double L in my part. I'll take the full blame for that. But Rosa Luxemburg does write about this quite a lot. And I think that she articulates it in a manner that's, easy to understand. But, my takeaway is that reformism is changing a structure that's going to still oppress you. It's still a structure built upon, like, capitalism is still built upon centuries of slavery, of anti-Blackness, of anti-queerness, anti-transness, colonialism, and imperialism. Capitalism cannot be reformed to be slightly more palatable for me and you. It is always still going to be an oppressive structure. The only way in which we can escape the oppression of capitalism is by abolishing that structure. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to be left in a world with nothing, because abolition is growth. It means that we are going to be left in a world with something, diametrically opposed to capitalism. And one really good way to articulate that is, by focusing on that constructive aspect of what abolition is that it's fundamentally growth, right? I'm not calling for an end to capitalism. I'm calling for an end to, I'm not calling for an end to, imagining what better change can look like, but I am rather calling for, an end to capitalism and a creation of what better places can look like, because those better places, will never be accessible to me under a capitalist world. And I think that's a really big contradiction between reformism and its goals that abolition is able to achieve.
As someone who is in New York right now and watching Eric Adams reach the top of the polls after the primaries yesterday, I just want to say thank you to whoever asked this question. But I definitely vibe a lot with like the idea that like abolition is not like, abolition requires imagination. In fact, abolition requires like imagination far beyond what reformism ever could be. And it's sort of like, I don't know how else to like say it, like express this, but like this idea of like capitalist realism, but like that the idea that like the end, like the only way that we can imagine change is through the lens of like, how can we modify capitalism to be like more palatable, or like, I guess like to be more like, I guess like accessible to like people. And I think like accessible is like a really like important like way to phrase this, because it's not like capitalism is like changing the way it works. is literally just like being like more accessible to like a lot of like to other people. Like I guess there's just like I guess I've been seeing more like the obsession of like Black people like gaining wealth. And while there is like a material benefit to Black people gaining wealth, like just as like a way to survive, a lot of people see that as the end goal instead of like a means of survival. And so that always comes to question of like, all right, like there's like a couple like Black millionaires. Now how about like the entirety of the Bronx? Like what are we supposed to do? Yeah, so just like any sort of like reform that they have is like not going to really change anything for like a lot of the people who are the most exploited, especially when we are looking at a more like international level, not just in like the United States.
And just to quickly add on to that, I think viewing reformism as an end goal is inherently violent and apolitical and ahistorical in many ways. But that doesn't mean we can't be viewing our collective struggle through a lens of materiality. So capitalism as a system is inherently violent and we must abolish it and imagine a different future. But while we are working through that material struggle, that doesn't mean we can't engage in practices that make the conditions in our communities inherently better. So I think it's a question of accelerating the demise of capitalism, or what they call like accelerationism, or engaging in a collective struggle against capitalism while also increasing like our material benefits. And I think that's why building like class consciousness, where people take capitalism as a given system, it is so important in the struggle, like whenever it's going to come, or all the time, honestly.
I will add on briefly my thoughts on voting here. I think voting is a form of harm reduction that is still complicit within a violent system. I do not excuse the white leftists who told all of us to settle for Biden and then got really quiet once Biden and Kamala started talking about telling Guatemalan immigrants to not come here. I'm not talking to you if that applies to you in the group. I am talking about, however, voting for policies, you know, for closing Rikers Island, voting against policies that would criminalize trans healthcare. I am talking about, you know, using that capability if you can, if you have the energy to engage in, you know, whatever forms of political harm reduction that you can to make life a little more palatable for us while we try to abolish and imagine, you know, better systems. And so, you know, I think that reformism in some ways, in some very small ways, is a form of harm reduction when we talk about voting to achieve abolitionist goals. But that should never be our end goal. Like Coben said, like reformism is not what we want.
All right, moving on to the next question from the audience. It says, I'm curious about capitalism and the downsides of it, as well as its negative impacts. Can you briefly explain that?
Any economic system that prioritizes property over people, that prioritizes profits over people, is going to construct something that continually, you know, oppresses and extracts and exploits the labor and the bodies and the existence of people who are, you know, who the system was not built for. Capitalism is fundamentally racial. Like when settlers headed over to the Americas and they expanded on native land, that act of colonialism was all for profit. Global imperialism as it is today is all for profit. When we manufacture wars in the Middle East, it's all for profit, right? Like when we advance agendas to cut healthcare for people, to not pass things like Medicare for all, it's because we prioritize profit in a way that the only way for us to, you know, keep money in our pockets, to line the pockets of like rich corporations and lobbyists, that is fundamentally what capitalism is, right? Capitalism hurts all of us. It hurts me when I'm not able to afford healthcare. It hurts me when I'm not able to afford housing. It hurts all of us in a sense that it has historically relied and is sustained on the exploitation of, you know, of Black people, of Indigenous people, of queer people, of trans people, of anyone who has some functionality in their body to be exploited under the system of capitalism, right? Like it's a continuously accelerating system that relies on generating more and more profit and exploiting the surplus value of the worker. And it never, ever produces something that prioritizes people over property, right? That's why we have things like, you like crime or prisons today, because we continue to prioritize preserving private property over the needs of the people.
And we would be incorrect to think that we could cover like capitalism as a political structure and the struggle against it in however many minutes we have left. I think it's do some reading. There are so many podcasts, books, and like honestly, like free resources. Like you can go to the anarchist library online, and there's so many like different things to read. And I think also when you're engaging in that like knowledge building process, like decentering white leftist voices and focusing on community organizers and people like Black and brown folks who are struggling against capitalism, not just in the United States, but transnationally in different countries across the world, is really, really important. Something that everyone should be engaging in, not just like in this discussion.
Right. The person who sent this question said, thank you, that makes a lot of sense. Moving on to the next question, if competitions and ballots aren't part of the goal of participation in debate, why does losing the framework matter?
Oh my. Because I think framework is bad. It doesn't matter that I don't necessarily think all the time that I should get the ballot. I just think that you shouldn't get the ballot for defending a violent argument, right? Like, I think that framework can be good. And I think that, Nay Edwards, in his paradigm, he is a proponent of T framework. He goes for T framework, and I respect that. But in all the ways in which I have hit T framework, I have never heard it articulated in a way that is constructive, that tells me, we should talk about how to engage with the state, because we should, the state is going to engage with us, even if we don't want to engage with it. We should talk about the resolution from that perspective. Like, sure, I will absolutely love to have a discussion with you about that. But if y'all are going to come in here and be like, if you don't need the ballot to complete your performance, why don't you just concede to T framework? That's what I'm not about to do, because T framework, in the way that y'all in high school articulate it time and time again, is something uniquely violent that continues to tell people that they should be pushed out of the space, that their voices don't matter, that their method is going to be, could be a little more effective if y'all just did it differently. But I'm not going to tell you how to do it differently. I'm just going to tell you to not do it. That is absolutely not what I'm asking for in this space, right? And in those cases, it's not so much a matter of, I don't care that much about the ballot. It's a matter of, I don't think you should get the ballot. I think you should take that L. And, I think that's also a little bit misconstruing of what we've been saying, right? We do want the ballot in some cases. We think that the judge deciding that, our method of debate is a good form of education, is a good performance that can, be better for our community, so we can get it to later out rounds, so more people can see it, so more people can learn from it. I think that's good, right? There are some cases where I want the ballot. That doesn't mean that I'm going to be upset if I don't get the ballot, but it means that, I think that the ballot should have a certain role of the ballot. And that's why I'm in this debate space advocating, because I think you should give me the ballot. And in some cases, I think that it's because you shouldn't have the ballot.
Yeah, I was sort of, not gonna lie, when you first read this question, I was so confused, because like the LD debater I am, I thought you meant like framework as in like framing instead of like T framework. But like, I guess, yeah, Anya definitely like hits around the nail, when it's just like, it's not even like why we should get the ballot. Just like if you walk into a round and your arguments are trash and you want us to endorse your trash arguments, we're not going to let you endorse your trash arguments. Like, it's simple as that. And so like, when we like, let's do what a lot of like lawyers like to do with some cost benefit analysis. If we turn the question back to them, right, and it's like, okay, there's no real reason for you to get the ballot if you want T, then if no one gets the ballot, then what is really at stake here? For you, it's just like, okay, sure, you just won another like T argument, like, and then you get to like finals, and then woohoo, you take another trophy. That's like some nice shiny medal you got. But when you get like, for like performance debaters, it's like always a question of like, what me performing in this round has, not for like marginalized people to like connect within the space, but like to be able to like sort of like gain a better understanding of how like structures of oppression impact them in the outside world. So it's like, if the discussions that you have within this play, like within debate, start and end at like you reading a theory shell, then why do we care about it like at all? Like I understand that like you might be like a little bit salty that like we want to ask for the ballot for us performing, but at the same question you might want to look in the mirror and be like, why am I this hard pressed by this person just like not reading the resolution?
And I think just really quickly, there's like a fine line between ballot commodification and viewing that as the only lens of validation from an oppressive system, which I think is like a fair criticism. And then also the line of reimagining what the ballot is deciding in the round, because if the ballot is not deciding a competitive struggle over rules with so-called procedural fairness, but rather endorsing the best deliberation strategy that the two debaters in the round came up with through engagement instead of evasion, then I think the ballot going to one of those debaters is a different question. And I think it's also important to recognize that T framework is always used as a tool to make a radical struggle or performance that challenges what debate looks like more palatable to an activity that is already inherently violent to so many marginalized folks, which is why that structure can be used tactically by people who have been historically oppressed by this space against others. But when it is used by someone who has the social location that always gets the benefit of the doubt in this space, then there are some like questions that you need to be asking yourself.
All right, we've just got a little bit under 10 minutes, so this will be the last question for today. Do you use a specific framework when constructing an argument?
I'm a bit confused by what framework means. Do you mean like a template or like a process or?
Give me a second. The person who said, to clarify, this is in LD.
Do you mean like framing? Like,
Yeah, because it sounds like it's sort of like from the phrasing, it's confusing whether they mean like whether we always use the same framing or whether we like try to like create our arguments in a certain way. Like both, I feel like both are valid questions. Just that like I don't want to misconstrue.
Just go ahead and answer both.
Okay. I feel like with like framing, I guess for me it's sort of like if it's a question of framing, I'd say it's just like no. I think like if you're using like reading like from different like literature bases or like reading different arguments, you're obviously going to start at like different points. Like for example, if you're reading like an argument that might be a bit more like hyper specific to like analysis of the debate space in like on the debate space, then like you might want to start from like the role of like the judge and like inheriting that space as like a way that you want to like frame things. For example, if like whether the role of the judge is meant to like educate or like is meant to like prioritize safety, or whether the ballot is meant to like I guess be used as like a way to I guess like further like propagate some sort of form of education, as compared to like if you're doing a more like system-based analysis. Like if you're focusing on anti-blackness, then you might want to prioritize the way that like anti-blackness might be like contextualized to like education of like stuff like capitalism or like cis heteronormativity, because though like that's those sort of like questions allow you to like, especially when engaging in KVK debate, we have that intersectional analysis ready to be able to provide a sort of like best liberation strategy for those like sort of like intersectional systems. I think also in the process of like, for the question of the like process of coming up with arguments, I think for me it's going to be like a question of like, one, what am I trying to achieve with like an argument? And number two, what sort of like things do I want to keep from this already existing space to sort of like achieve those things? I think like, I guess to give an example of like the Diddy Bob Basie that I was reading last year, like my main point was to like have the debate be a space where I can like, I guess, engage in this sort of like Afrofuturist like imagination of like what life would be if I wasn't like necessarily closeted. But so in that way, it's like, yeah, we can keep some sort of like competition in a sort of way, or like if you want to, you can have these sort of like readings of like policy making in another round, but just that my model debate will be prioritizing people who want to engage in the like the debate space as a form of safety above anything else.
I think for me, the way I interpret this question, and I'll keep it brief so we don't keep everyone here too long, and so Coben gets a chance to speak, is I think about debate in layers. Like the first thing that comes to me is performance, right? Like I always think form over content. Is my form accessible? Is my form good? What is my form? And then from there, I proceed on to, I use form as a way to access content, right? Like, why am I choosing this form? You know, what does that say about my content? And then that, you know, that starting point of performance is what lets me determine what my role of the ballot, what my role of the judge looks like, or even if I have one, if I want to read cards or not. In a more philosophical sense, I suppose, my framing is usually always something that is optimistic, which is strange, I think, because for most of the LD season, I read a lot of pessimistic literature. But for me, pessimistic literature has always been optimistic in some nature because it's about imagining what something looks like after you embrace pessimism. You know, and in that doing so, I think that's a way for me to view different forms of literature in ways that I might not have like originally conceptualized them. And so that allows me to be more creative with my framework.
Yeah, and just really, really quickly, I agree with everything Dahlia and Anya have said. I think it just honestly depends on what you view framing as and what starting point you are coming from, determines what the framing mechanism that you're engaging in your struggle or your form of knowledge building or community engagement or safety, or just existing inside of the space. So I think you have to ask yourself, and what I do when I'm writing whatever argument or performance I'm going to read is what am I trying to do here? And then laying out a framing for the rest of the round based off of that question and goal.
All right, if that was our last question, thank you so much for moderating, Io. I'm gonna drop the donation links once more so y'all can pay us for our time and labor. If you're not able to, message someone who can, tell them to give their precious money to us. In the chat, these are all of us who are accepting compensation. But yeah, thank you so much for taking your time to come out for our panel. We're really glad that y'all have so many questions. We appreciate y'all staying with us and listening to us. And as always, if you have more questions, at least for me, you're free to contact me. I will say, if you do start engaging in a way that I feel is disingenuous, I will kindly ask you to go outside and do a little more learning before you can come back and engage with me in this conversation. But yeah, other than that, you know, thank you so much for coming. We hope y'all have a great evening. And of course, thank you so much to Coben and Dahlia for agreeing to do this too. And thank you to Caleb for organizing this, you know, or giving us the idea to do this.
And Manny for streaming it on PF Video.
Yeah. This will be available as a recording on, is it going to be uploaded or it'll be available after, right? Okay, yeah, this will be available on PF Videos after, and we do have a recording of this as well. So to those of y'all that didn't make it, you know, we'll always be able to have a stored version of that for y'all. But yeah, thank you so